When you bind to a collection, WPF creates a collection view. And the view manages currency, which is the position of the current item, and it also gives you the ability to navigate, sort, filter, and group. So in that sense, a view in WPF is similar to a view in ADO.NET. To use a view in code, you can use an instance of the collection view class. And to get a reference to the collection view, you call the getDefaultView method of the collection view source. And the collection view source is the XAML representation of the view. Once you have a reference to the view, then you can navigate, sort, and filter because the collection view class has a number of methods and properties that support that. So for navigation, you can use methods like moveCurrent to first, moveCurrent to previous, moveCurrent to next, and moveCurrent to last to move from a record to record. There's also properties for current item and current position. Current item, if you're looking at a list of customers, for example, current item is how you would know which customer you're currently looking at. If you want to do sorting, then you use the sort descriptions property of the collection view class, and this contains a collection of sort description structures. And that structure specifies the column to sort on and the order. You can add a sorting order by calling the add method of the sort descriptions property of the collection view class. You can sort by more than one thing, so region and city, country and company name, and then to clear a sort, you just call the clear method of sort descriptions. There are a couple ways of doing filtering. The most straightforward way is to cast the view to an instance of the binding list collection and then set the custom filter property of that to a filter expression. And that will filter out items in the view that don't match that filter expression. And then if you want to clear the filter and see everything in the collection, then you just set custom filter to an empty string. The collection view source is the XAML representation of the view, and the benefit of that is you can define views in XAML rather than in code. So here we're defining a view source for customers, and we're saying that this source should contain the contents of the customers table in the Northwind dataset. So let's go see how to use the collection view and the collection view source in applications to navigate, sort, and filter. I've got the Working with Data sample application back up and running. Let's take a look at using the collection view and the collection view source. So we'll look at the collection view first, and here is a classic data entry form. When the form loads, I bring up customers. I'm looking at the first customer. I can scroll from customer to customer, forwards and backwards. I can go to the last customer. I can go to the first customer. And I'll be able to add, delete, undo my changes, and save my changes. I'll also be able to sort by ID, by city, and by country, view only the customers in the US or all of them, and find a particular customer. And we're going to see how to do all of that in this window. So let's look at the XAML first. Let's move this aside. Get rid of that. And let's just drop this down. There we go. So I've got buttons. My navigation buttons are in the upper left. They're in a stack panel docked on the left. My data modification buttons are in a stack panel docked on the right. And then my sort and filter buttons are in a stack panel docked on the left, and the find text box and the find button are in a stack panel docked on the right below the modification buttons. Then I have a grid, and that grid has a number of rows, and the text boxes in the grid are bound to columns of the customers table. Now notice that nowhere in the XAML am I setting any data contexts. The grid doesn't have a data context set. The window doesn't have a data context set. That's all done in code. So let's go see the code. I have three declarations. Northwind Dataset is an instance of the Northwind Dataset class. I have the customers table adapter, and then I have customers view, which is an instance of the collection view class. And then when the window loads, I create a new instance of the Northwind dataset, get a new instance of the customers table adapter, and call the fill method of that table adapter to retrieve the customers from the Northwind database and fill the customers data table in the dataset. Then I set the data context of the window to customers. And because of the XAML containership model, that now means that the grid and the text boxes in the grid are also bound to the customers table. Then I need a view to be able to navigate. So to get a view, I can call the getDefaultView method of the collectionViewSource class and point it to customers, and now this will give me a view based on the customers table. I cast that to collectionView, and now customers view is my view of the customers table, and I can then move current to first. Let's be clear about this. So I'm going to comment this out, and let's run this and see what happens. This is just to understand what's going on. So notice that when the window loads, data appears. That's because as soon as I set the context to the customers table, the grid and the text boxes are bound to data. So the first customer appears, but what I can't do now is navigate. If I click the next button, I'm going to throw an exception because I don't have a view, and therefore I can't call methods of the view. So to get data, all I need to do is set the data context, but to navigate with it, I need a view. So now let's run this again and see what happens when we navigate and move around. I have buttons for first, previous, next, and last. And so if I click next, then I'm going to run this code. First thing I'm going to do is make sure I'm not at the last item in the list. So I check the current position of the view, and if it's less than the count minus 1, then I know I'm not on the last customer, and I'm going to call the moveCurrentToNext method to move to the next item in the list. If I click the last button, I'll move current to last, and at this point clicking next does nothing because I'm on the last item. If I want to move to the first item, then I'll move current to first, and when I click the previous button, I'm going to check to make sure that I'm not on the first item in the list, so if current position is greater than 0, then I can move current to previous. So if I'm not on the first item, then I can move previous. By calling the various move methods of the view, I can navigate forwards and backwards in the list. I can also sort. I can sort by ID, which is the default sort order. I can sort by city or by country. Let's look at the code for those. That's down here. So if I click sort by city, here's the code that runs. I'm going to get the sort descriptions property of the customer's view, which is a collection of sort description structures. So I'm going to add a new sort description, and I'm going to specify the column to sort on and the direction. So I've now sorted customers by city. So of course, as I scroll from city to city, I can see that the customers are in city order alphabetically. I can sort by more than one thing at a time, so if I sort by country, I want to sort by country and then within each country by city. So I first clear the sort descriptions, and then I add a sort description based on country and another one based on city, and then I move current to first. So when I clicked on sort by city, I moved current to first. And when I clicked on sort by country, and now these are sorted by country and within each country by city. Now if I want to clear the sort, I can click this sort by ID column, and I clear the collection of sort descriptions and then move current to first. If if I click the USA Only button, I'm going to filter the customers and only see customers in the US. Let's look at the code to do that. The collection view class actually has a filter property, but to use it, you set it to a predicate, which is basically a delegate. So you create a method that filters. I think an easier way is to bind the collection view to a binding list collection view and then use the custom filter property, which just takes a string. So when I clicked USA Only, I bound customers view, I cast customers view to a binding list collection view, made sure it wasn't null, and then set the custom filter property to country equals USA, and then I move current to first. So now the only thing in here are customers in the US. If I want to see all of them, I clear the filter, and I set the custom filter to an empty string. Another way of filtering is to only show one customer. So that's really what the find does. If I type Anton in here and click Find, then I'm only going to display that customer. And the way I'm doing that is by setting a filter. And I can do that here because I have all of the customer data local. If I was retrieving one customer at a time, then to find a particular customer, I'd execute a query against the SQL Server database. But because I downloaded all of the customers to begin with, I can show one customer by setting a filter. And so I set the custom filter property of the binding list collection view to customer ID equals whatever was entered into the find text box, converted to upper. Customer IDs are in uppercase, but I don't feel like having to type uppercase, so I'll just convert it in code. And then if I want to see them all, I clear the filter by setting the custom filter property to an empty string. Now, no self-respecting classic data entry form would be complete without the ability to add, delete, and save items. And this doesn't really have anything to do with the collection view, but it needs to be covered, so this is as good a place as any. So, what happens if I click Add? I'm going to create a new instance of the customers row class by calling the new customers row method of the customers table. So now new row represents a new customer row. And then, because customer ID and company name are required, I'm going to give them placeholders and just enter TBD. Now, if I saved a new customer without a customer ID or a company name, then an exception would be thrown. So at this point, I could actually save this. It's not valid data, but it doesn't throw an exception. Then I'm going to add this new row to the customers table and move current to last. So this is now a real live row in the customers table with TBD as the customer ID and the company name. So now I'll actually enter some data, big, and we'll call this Big Co. Robert Green's the contact. President is the title in Redmond, Washington. And now when I click Save, what will happen? I'm going to call the update method of the customers table adapter and send all of the changes back to the dataset. If that method returns a number greater than 0, then the save worked. So the customer information was saved. And now what I should be able to do to prove that, exit out of here, come back in, search for Big, and there's the customer. And the company name is now Big Co TBD because I didn't blank that out. So let's make that change, and I can save the changes. What I can also do at this point is undo the changes. So if I click the undo button, I'm going to check to see if the dataset has changes, and if it does, I'm going to ask the user, do you want to undo all of your changes? So not only any changes that I do here, but any changes that I do to other records. So let's go to Alfred's Futterkist and make a change here. And now, If I click undo, do I want to undo all of my changes? If I say yes, then I run this code here, northwinddataset.reject changes, and that throws away all of my changes. So now, let's come back in. The customer ALF key did not get the contact name changed, and any change I made to big didn't go through either. And then finally, I can delete. So if I click the delete button, I'm first going to make sure that I'm on a current item. Prompt, do I want to delete the customer? If I say yes, I'll take the current item, which is an object, cast it to a data row view so that I can get the row, so that I can call the delete method and delete that row and then save the changes. And the customer was deleted. Now, exit, come back in. I like to do that to prove that what I say is happening is really happening. And now if I search for big, it's not found. So again, here's a classic data entry form with navigating, moving backwards and forwards, modifying data, sorting, filtering, searching, the whole works. And the navigation, sorting, and filtering is because I have a view, specifically an instance of the collection view, and then the data modification is basically just pretty straightforward ADO.NET. Now let's look at another way to do this. We can use a collection view source. So here's the exact same form which does the exact same things. The difference is that we're using a collection view source. So let's look at this XAML here. Look at the Windows resources. I have a resource called Northwind Dataset, and then I have a collection view source called Customers View Source that is bound to the customers table in the Northwind Dataset. Now how does that get populated? Well, let's look at the code here. The first thing that happens is I go and get that resource, Northwind Dataset, and I cast it to an instance of the Northwind Dataset. So basically, at that point, I've populated this resource. In the next line of code, I get the customers adapter, run the query, and fill the customers table. And the customers view source is configured to be bound to that customers table. So I already have the customers table, I already have the Northwind Dataset, but I need to essentially populate that. So I find that resource, cast it to an instance of collection view source, and then set it equal to my variable customers view source. And so at this point, when I've run this line of code, I've populated customers view source and pointed it to the customers table. Now in order to navigate, I need a view. I don't have a view at this point, I have a collection view source, but the collection view source has a view property. I get the view of customers view source, cast it to collection view, and now customers view is an instance of the collection view class, so I can move current to first. And now all of the rest of the code in here is exactly the same as it was in the previous example. And then one last thing to show is that the grid is bound to customers view source. So in the XAML, the data context property of the grid is set to customers view source, which is the XAML equivalent of, in the previous example, setting the data context to customers. So in the first example, we set the data context of the window to customers. In this example, we set the data context of the grid to customers view source, and then we set up a collection view source in XAML, and then got the view in code. So is there really a big difference between the two of those? If we're working with one table at a time, not so much. When would you use a collection view source? If you're using multiple tables and you're doing one-to-many relationships or one-to-many, then the collection view source comes in really handy. And when you do drag and drop data binding, Visual Studio uses a collection view source. Let's go see that. I'm going to create a new project, and it's going to be a WPF application, and I will call this drag and drop data binding. Drag and drop data binding has been around in Visual Studio since 2005 for Windows Forms. In Visual Studio 2010, you can now use drag and drop data binding with WPF. So I'm going to change the title of this window to Customers, and personal preference, Windows startup location, I will set to center screen because I like my windows to show up in the middle of the screen. I'll set the height to 700 and the width to 900 just to make sure we have enough room for everything. And now what I'm going to do is go get some data. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a new data source. This calls up the data source configuration wizard. Where do I want to get my data from? I have a number of choices. I'll choose database. What type of database model do I want to use? Entity framework or dataset? I'll use a dataset. I'm going to connect to the Northwind database. Save my connection string in the application.configuration file. And now Visual Studio queries the database and brings back a list of the database objects. I want to create a data source based on the customers table and the orders and the order details tables. And I'll click Finish. Now Visual Studio creates the Northwind dataset, and if I show my data sources window, here are my data sources. Here's the customers table, and as a node in that is orders, and that represents the related orders for that customer. And as a node inside orders is order details. This data source knows about and respects the one-to-many relationship between customers' orders and order details. Now let's get some data in the window. I'm going to take the customers table from the data sources node and drag and drop it into the window. And this adds a grid. Let's make it wide enough to fit the window, and we can make it a little bit taller as well. Now, what did Visual Studio add? Let's look at the XAML. Visual Studio added in the Window Resources section Northwind dataset and a collection view source bound to the customers table in the Northwind dataset. So this is essentially the same XAML we saw in the previous example. The only difference is that I think I used local and Visual Studio uses my. Other than that, it's essentially the same. And then Visual Studio added a grid and set its data context to customers view source. Let's look at the code that was added. And it's all on one line. Be nice if Visual Studio put this on multiple lines, but it doesn't. So the first thing we do is we get this resource, Northwind dataset, and cast it to an instance of the Northwind dataset. Get the customers table adapter and call the fill method and fill the customers table. And then get this resource customers view source, cast it to collection view source, and then call the move current to first method of the view that belongs to the collection view source. So almost the same code that we'd use in our previous example. Now let's run this. The runtime retrieves the customer's data and displays them in the grid. Okay, let's add more data to this. Let's get orders. So I'm going to take the orders table in the data source and drag it and drop it, and drag it and drop it onto the window. And let's make it take up about half the available space. All right, what did Visual Studio add? A bunch of more XAML, starting with another collection view source. This one called Customers Orders View Source. And it basically says start with the Customers View Source, which is the customers table, and then bind to the one-to-many relationship between customers and orders. And then Visual Studio added this data grid and set the item source to customers orders view source. And then what code got added? We have a reference to the orders table adapter fill it, so bring down all of the orders, and then essentially populate this customer's orders view source, and then move current to first in the orders view source. Customer's orders view source, actually. When we run this, we now see customers and orders, and as we scroll from customer to customer, we see the orders for that customer in the orders grid. Okay, let's finish this. Let's bring down order details. So I'm going to take the order details that appears as a node of the orders table. So that recognizes the one-to-many relationship between orders and order details. Fill out the rest of the form for symmetry. Let's see what Visual Studio added. Another collection view source. This one called Customers Orders Order underscore Details View Source. Bound to the relationship, the one-to-many relationship between orders and order details. And then Visual Studio added another data grid, which is this one here, and set the item source to Customers Orders Order Details View Source. The code that gets added is going to be the code to return order details. So get an instance of the order details table adapter, call the fill method, bring down the order details, find this reference, Customers Orders Order Details View Source, cast it to a collection view source, find the view, move current to first. So move to the first order detail. And now when I run this, we have customers, we have orders, we have order details. As I scroll from customer to customer, I see the orders, and as I scroll from order to order, I see the details for that order. What you've seen in this demo are some examples of common data entry forms. We saw how to use the collection view, and that gave us the ability to navigate from record to record as well as sort and filter. We saw the ability to add, delete, and update information. We saw how to use the collection view source, which is the XAML representation of the view, and we've just seen how the collection view source makes it easy to build master detail type windows. And we saw how the collection view source makes it easy to account for one-to-many and one-to-many-to-many relationships.